Lately, I've been checking out a few reviews about Zack Snyder's Justice League from individuals whom I thought their thoughts about the film would be interesting in general. And what most of them talk about or point out in a negative sense about the movie is that there, quote unquote, wasn't a lot of build up and solo movies prior to the characters within the movie. And to me, that kind of worked as a bit of a PTSD trigger and kind of reminded me the era that we were back in 2016 when BVS and Suicide Squad came out. And I wanted to dissect this theory or even obsession in some cases that you have to quote unquote build up or have solo movies in order to build up towards your big team up movie, if you will. But before we begin, I would like to ask you that if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel as it helps out a great deal. But now onto the video. One of the biggest complaints labeled specifically against the DCEU from its conception or inception was that you have to build up your characters for your big team-up movies. This was something I mentioned beforehand, and this was something that I never actually understood, because when you really think about this whole sentence, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense when you put this into context with other movies, not necessarily within the superhero kind of subgenre of movies, but within just movies or just art or literature itself. But first of all, the biggest paradox that I can think of within the Marvel universe itself, of course, is Guardians of the Galaxy, where basically you have like 5 or 6 characters in some cases having their big team up movie, if you will, in the first movie itself. And when you really think about it, isn't that kind of counterintuitive that the people who were saying that you have to build up your characters in order to have a team up movie or quote unquote earn that team up movie, which is one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard in my life, because this was not the case prior to the Avengers and Marvel just cracking that formula. But back to Guardians of the Galaxy, this was never a criticism labeled against that movie, only against DC movies or just other franchises in general when you really think about it. But as I mentioned before, when we are talking about these like quote-unquote team-up movies, there are a few basic storytelling examples within the medium of cinema that I can think of, and the main two ones are basically Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings. As of course with them, for some reason people didn't bring up this nonsensical statement that Star Wars doesn't work because I would have wanted to see a trilogy with Luke Skywalker and a Chewbacca origin movie, because therefore I could relate to the characters more. But if this was indeed the only way to tell the story, is to build up your characters through solo endeavors to a big team up moment, then of course it raises a ton of questions, and we have to reevaluate everything beforehand as well. And you have to ask yourself the question, does it ruin my enjoyment of Star Wars that there are not a lot of solo films? No pun intended, of course, prior to leading up the first Star Wars movie, because Star Wars has always been a trilogy of movies, or 2 trilogy of movies, or just a franchise in general which tells its story in a trilogy. In a sense, there wasn't really a lot of wiggle room with the characters when you really think about this whole setup of how the story was written. The same goes for The Lord of the Rings. Like, The Lord of the Rings, it's a contained story within a trilogy, and it doesn't ruin anybody's enjoyment that you don't see or know more about Strider's character or Aragorn's character, of course, or Pippin or Frodo's, for example. Like, nobody went into the movie and labeled that criticism against it, because the whole point of The Lord of the Rings is that it's an epic, and it's not this kind of build up to the fellowship, if you will, because when you really consider that and put it in the context or modern context or superhero context, like the Fellowship of the Ring is basically the Avengers or the Justice League, as you see a lot of different people teaming up for one specific purpose. But when you go back and watch The Lord of the Rings, nobody says that I couldn't connect with the characters because I didn't see a lot of spin-off movies with them. And I believe that you were conditioned to believe, ever since Marvel kind of cracked this formula and perfected it, that superhero characters are somehow different from cinematic characters such as Luke Skywalker, for example. And my main criticism has always been against these, not just the people that are making these claims, but against the claims themselves, that we are not dealing with superhero characters. First of all, we are dealing with characters in general. Like, when I think about Batman, I place him on the same pedestal as Luke Skywalker as a fictional character. When I think about Superman as well, I do the same thing. And I feel like that this is kind of a cop-out in order to develop these characters, because when you say that it's just a superhero character, quote unquote, you're kind of devaluing the worth of the character, saying that this is just a two-dimensional character for kids and we don't have to take it seriously. Whereas with Batman, everybody takes Batman seriously because we know how important that character is. The same goes for Superman as well. And this just goes back to artistic integrity when you think about it, is that there is no definitive way of telling a story that you want to tell. But of course, when we're talking about superhero characters, those characters were born within the comic book genre or medium itself. But when you translate that into film, it looks very different. As the same goes for what Watchmen was and why the Watchmen movie is different from the comic. It's because it's a different medium and the same things don't work there. And you had to figure out how to translate that feeling of the graphic novel into a different medium. And maybe my biggest criticism against this way of thinking that you need original solo films is that making original solo films is not a creative decision by the people who make these movies. As of course, I go back to Star Wars. George Lucas never wanted to make that. He wanted to tell his story with these characters. And making these solo or filler films is just a decision made by the marketing executives to make more money within the property itself. Put it into plain words, to milk it to death, basically, for what it's worth. And when we discuss this from an artistic perspective, this is the most creatively bankrupt thing, as the monetary gain from these franchises and characters is the priority instead of artistic integrity and storytelling freedom. And you can see this with the Avengers movies, as like Thanos was a completely different character back when he was kind of first introduced in the end credit scene of the first Avengers, if I remember correctly, than when he actually arrives in Avengers Infinity War. And I feel like that, as I mentioned before, that people were kind of conditioned to this way of storytelling and quote-unquote building up, which is really funny because even when the new Star Wars trilogy came out by Disney, nobody labeled this criticism against them, because for some reason Star Wars is somehow different from Marvel in a sense, even though they are both stories and they are both characters. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, again, when you really think about this thing. And when it comes to this quote-unquote building up, this is a truly false sentiment when you really think about it. It's just a cheap way of saying that we have absolutely no idea what we are going to do with these characters and we are going to milk them to death. The way with artistic integrity is that you tell the story that you want to tell in a format where it fits your idea of the story. And as I mentioned before, these kind of original solo films or spin-off films, they are just filler content. As think about Star Wars. And when you think about Star Wars between, let's say, episode 4 and 5, there is not a whole lot of wiggle room with the characters or the stories that you can tell. And this is what Star Wars or Marvel has been doing with the Star Wars comics, is that they based a lot of their comics between episodes 4 and 5. And of course, there is not a lot that you can do with the characters, as of course, their paths are clearly set between the movies. And you cannot really further the characters' arcs or basically have no relevancy to it. You just tell the stories for the sake of telling those stories and milking the franchise for what it's basically worth. And my biggest parallel has always been to this kind of Marvel formula or this Marvel way of storytelling is the Wu-Tang formula. As I don't think I've mentioned before, but I was a huge, and I'm still a big fan of Wu-Tang Clan, as they have had a profound impact on me as a young adult and a teenager. Their kind of strategy was back in the day, back in 92, is that they have appeared in the industry with a big bang, of course with a single that they have released, and then they have released an album where like 7 rappers were in that whole album, completely new of course, but people knew about them because the single that they released was insanely awesome and completely new in a sense. And when the album came out, people knew about them and they bought the album, of course. And then after the huge success of the 36 Chambers, which was their first album, then they released singles with the rappers that were on the, or the MCs that were on the album. And after that, back in 97, after the album came out in 93 and then in 97, they released a huge LP with, again, carrying all that success and international renown, if you will, from the single albums and the previous album. They've carried that on to that huge album again. And this was kind of their plan to dominating the industry for 5 years. As when somebody was telling me that like these stories have to be told this way, I always pointed this to them, that you can actually make this work like Wu-Tang did. And the way I see it is that Zack Snyder originally wanted the DCEU to be something like this, that you start with Man of Steel and then you move into BVS, and of course Suicide Squad is kind of this middle chapter between BVS and Justice League, but you could spin off to a whole lot of other movies as they did with Wonder Woman and Aquaman, and then you could come back to watch Justice League 2 and 3. But hopefully we will get to see more of that, just even the Justice League installments in the future. But thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did so, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this one, and leave a comment and let's talk some storytelling and what do you think about these solo movies, or just quote-unquote building up to these like huge events or team-up movies. And I'll see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.